Okay, so welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce the speakers of this morning. Joanna Drucker couldn't make it to be here today, but she will present her paper today at 5 p.m. And so we're starting with Andrea Pinotti, who's a professor at the University of Milan in the field of aesthetics, philosophy of language, and image theory. He's a promoter of important international research projects, and associated with his name is an impressive list of distinctions, awards, fellowships. He published several books dealing with German art theory, Zamper, Riegel, Wölfflin, and also a book in Italian on title is, if I can render it in English, at the threshold of the image, from Narcissus to virtual reality. So the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Giulia, for your introduction, and thank you very much to Giulia and Enzo for this invitation. I'm very glad to share some ideas with you. It's a work in progress because it's actually something I am developing with my research group, the ERC group, on iconology, on history, theory, and practices of environmental images. So my proposal today would be to speak about polarity in new technologies, in digital environments, immersion. Actually, as a non-native speaker, I already have some difficulties in pronouncing it because the difference in the first place is very difficult to hear, no? And I tried to find some help in the phonetic transcription, but as you can see, it's pretty much the same. So I will perhaps say immersion and immersion to try and underline this difference, which I propose to associate with two main typologies of production in digital images today. That is immersion as the emergence of digital objects in augmented reality, in AR, and immersion, again, this water metaphor, this liquid metaphor, which is very interesting. They are developing also headsets to go waterproof, to go underwater, which apparently, according to some researchers, would be the best way to experience virtual reality underwater. So VR as immersion. So I will show you some very well-known examples of the emergence of augmented reality, for example, in the app place developed by IKEA. So AR brings the digital object here in our living room, in my actual environment. The digital object emerges, you could say, appears. It's a kind of epiphany, integrating or augmenting my perceptual field. On the contrary, if we move to virtual reality, this is a very famous, at least among virtual reality scholars, experience, very simple and at the same time, I think, very enlightening as regards what is at stake when you have an experience of virtual reality. It's the walk the plank experience. Here you have a football team, a British football team. They are invited to don a headset. In front of them, there is a plank. They are safe. They know they are in a room. And they are, as athletes, very well trained in controlling their physiological responses, their muscles, for example. Let's see what happens. First attempt, you put on the headset, you find yourself in a lift, you push the button, and the lift takes you at the top of a skyscraper, in which the doors open, and there's a plank, and you are outside. You're already feeling some kind of discomfort. There are many beeps in this video because there are many four-letter words, of course. We put on like this because nobody in the team is able even to take a step forward on the plank. So in virtual reality, you are taken there, outside that window on the top of the skyscraper. Of course, you are also here because the athlete is here in the room. He knows he's there, he's safe. So you are taken there in an audio-visual way because you hear sounds of the wind, for example, but and you see the skyscraper and you see the abyss. Because the most sadistic version of this experiment is that if you make it to reach the end of the plank, you are asked to jump. Then you see yourself in this precipitation and you fall down and you eventually crash. But of course, you know that you are safe. So there is a cognitive and perceptual conflict. Not just cognitive, because from a proprioceptive point of view, you should feel that you are in the room and you had seen the plank safely placed on the floor. And nevertheless, this is really a conflict which arises between what you know, your proprioceptive feelings, and the information given to your brain by the audiovisual system. And as you have seen, even in very trained athletes, it's not going to work. I mean, the conflict is not solved. And we, together with Sophia and other colleagues, we have tried many times this experience, but every time, even if it's true that there is a habit and you get accustomed to it, but nevertheless, it's always a very strong experience. It is also true that this conflict between here and there, one might argue, raises also in the situation of AR and not just VR, because you visualize in an augmented way the armchair in your living room, but you cannot sit on it. So you have to go to IKEA to buy there, to buy the armchair. And you must accept the risks of going to IKEA, as happened to this poor guy in Belgium, in Arnhem, rescued after being lost for 12 days in the shop.
That's the onion. That's not perfect.
So here and there, as a polarity connected to respectively Immersion, emergence, epiphany of the augmented digital object, and there, because I am teleported, as they say, in a different world. And this has to do with deixis. From the Greek Yanis might help me in pronouncing it. Show. Meaning that here and there are always referred to the subject and his or her position in space and time. So I can say here, but this here for me is there for you because you are distant from me. This regards not only spatial relations, but also temporal relation. Later, tomorrow, soon, always refer to the person speaking. And this has to do, of course, also with the questions of peripersonal space, because here is where I can reach the object through my arm, through my hand, we could say the tactile space. There, it's the distal space. I see the object, but I cannot reach it directly. And of course, these things, the situation fades away in further distances and various degrees of the there. Closer, more distant. And the situation gets more entangled, of course, when we address an intersubjective condition. And of course, my here is your there, and vice versa. And this gets a lot complicated when you are a group or a community of people, and we have all experienced misunderstanding, saying now or here, there, and this or that, of course. Going back to our beloved Husserl, even if he does not speak of the X's, there are many pages in his reflections on the body which could be associated with reflections on the X's. For him, the deictic center, even if he does not call it in this way, is the own living body, the life. With regard to all other things, he says, I have the freedom to change at will my position in relation to them, so I can look at this from here, turn around, Abschattungen and Kerne, adumbrations and nucleus. I can vary the manifolds of our appearance, the aspects of the world. So here we share this very same room, but we all see different aspects of this room. But I do not have the possibility of distancing myself from my body or my body from me. So I am always anchored, so to say, to my living body, to my life. There are, of course, some ways to challenge this standard phenomenological definition. For example, the out-of-body experience, the OBE, which is an otoscopy, meaning that you see yourself from the outside. There are mystical explanations, for example, astral projection or the experience of the doppelganger. There are more scientific and rational explanations. You have these out-of-body experiences. For example, if you suffer from brain injuries, dissociative and psychedelic drugs, or we have a member of our group studying these experiences, near-death experiences, which brings us back to going to the IKEA, of course. This is, I won't deal with out-of-body experiences. This is another way to challenge that phenomenological account, because in virtual reality, as we have seen, you are invited to have an experience which detaches somehow yourself from your position of your life in a specific place, and you feel yourself that you are somehow simultaneously in two different places, here in the room and over there out of the sky, of the skyscraper. This possibility of being in two places at the same time was one of the dreams of the first pioneers in virtual reality. For example, the MIT scientist and researcher Marvin Minsky, who wrote this famous and pioneering essay, Telepresence, back in 1980. The biggest challenge, he says, to developing telepresence is achieving that sense of being there. I am here, but at the same time, I am there and I operate with devices. Can telepresence be, this was the big question, a true substitute for the real thing? And if we think of the rapid developments in telerobotics, in the last decades, we might say that such a dream was not utopian after all. It is very interesting to hear from Minsky how he had imagined the situation of teleportation. You don a comfortable jacket lined with sensor, muscle-like motors. Each motion of your arm, hand, and finger is reproduced at another place. So you move the arm here, and another mechanical arm is moving over there by mobile mechanical hands. Using this instrument, you can work in another room, in another city, in another country, on another planet. And of course, you can spot a kind of heredity of illuminism here. Heat or pain is translated into informative but tolerable sensation. Your dangerous job becomes safe and pleasant. So technology as a way to solve the problems of human finitude. But also interesting that as he himself acknowledges, he was inspired by science fiction, and particularly by this writer, Robert Heinlein, and his novel Waldo, 1942, in which the hero, Waldo, suffers from congenital myasthenia, so a pathology of the muscles. And so he runs and he travels and he moves to the outer space. And from there, he runs his business on Earth. He has enterprises on Earth. And through teleportation, and at the same time profiting of the zero gravity, which helps him with this myasthenic pathologies, he is able to work. So just think that 3 years after the publication of the novel, some American companies developed these tele-commanded mechanical arms, which were named after the hero described by Heinlein, Waldo, to, for example, manipulate radioactive objects. But the story goes back much earlier than science fiction in the 40s, because it is the ancient miracle of bilocation of the saints. Here you have a depiction of a very famous bilocation. St. Francis appears in Arles in front of St. Anthony and his monks. And this is an anecdote, a legend from the Legenda Aurea, which has been depicted 2 times by Giotto, once in Santa Croce and the other one in the Church of St. Francis in Assisi. And of course, St. Francis goes there in Arles from Assisi, but for Antonio, it's here, because Francis is there here for him. There are many examples I am trying to reconstruct, as I told Massimo and Ralph and Maria Giulia yesterday, this history of bilocation, which is very fascinating. Another example is Padre Pio. I have read these proceedings of the Inquisitor, because Padre Pio was suspected of being a kind of impostor. So the Vatican in 1921 sends an inquisitor to his convent in Giulia, and the inquisitor asks, it was the Cardinal of Volterra, Carlo Rossi, asked him questions. How happens? How could you be at the same time in 2 places in your convent? And he entered the convent when he was 18, and he never went out of the convent. But there were many ill people who testified that he had been at their bed helping them. So he says, well, I don't know. I don't know whether my mind was transported there, if I was there with my body. So he's very prudent and cautious, because he is afraid probably of some Inquisition bonfire. In the church of San Giovanni Rotondo, you can find this mosaic depicting Padre Pio bringing the Eucharist to a cardinal. I cannot really pronounce this surname, Mitsenti, who had been imprisoned in Budapest during the regime in the 50s. And Mitsenti has witnessed that Padre Pio was there giving him a communion. And again, Padre Pio is in Puglia, he is there in Budapest, and at the same time, he appears here for Cardinal Vicente. This dream, this miracle is transcultural. Yogananda, the man who is responsible for the introduction of yoga in our Western culture, in his autobiography published in 1946, tells the story of his guru, Sri Yukteswar. And it's a bit cut, the slide on the right, I'm sorry. This story runs like this, that Sri lives in Serampore, but he has some business to do in Calcutta, and so he is required in Calcutta. So he said, I'm taking the train, I'm going to Calcutta, but I'm coming back tonight at 10 o'clock. So please, Yogananda, fetch me at the station at 10 o'clock. But actually the business is shorter than expected. So he thinks he must change his schedule and arrive in going back to Serampore at 9 o'clock in the evening and not at 10. And he sends a telepathic message to his pupil saying, I've changed my mind, come earlier. But he is not sure that the telepathic message has really arrived. So he teleports, he bilocates, and he appears in front of Yogananda in Serampore. This is not an apparition. He is bolder than Padre Pio. He's sure that this apparition is in the flesh. And Yogananda says, I touched him, and it was really in the flesh there. I cannot help but thinking that this is how we nowadays think of WhatsApp. You send a message until it's gray, you're not sure. But when it becomes green, you are reassured that the person you have sent the message to, so bilocation as a way to communicate as well. Is this a real challenge to the phenomenological account given by Husserl about the anchorage of the here in your own life, in your own living body? It depends on what phenomenology you are looking for, because if you switch from Husserl to Merleau-Ponty, a phenomenology of perception, 1945, which is the same time as the autobiography of Yogananda, as the invention of the mechanical arms and teleportation, Minsky, etc. My body is wherever there is something to be done. Mon corps est là où il y a quelque chose à faire. So this is a question of pragmatics. This is a question of action. This is a question of having to do things, having to fetch somebody at the station, for example. Even more interesting is the fact that look how Merleau-Ponty defines this body, virtual. What counts for the orientation is not my body as it in fact is, as a thing in objective space, but as a system of possible actions, a virtual body, corps virtuel, with its phenomenal place defined by its task and situation, again, a pragmatic situation. So this is very intriguing. Of course, Merleau-Ponty knew nothing about virtual reality as we nowadays experience it. But virtual, as you all know, is virtualis, is virtus, has a very long philosophical history in the terminology, for example, of scholastic scholars, scholastic philosophers like Thomas, and back to the opposition between actual and potential in Aristotle. One of the problems, of course, again, if we move from a phenomenological account of these situations, I insist on the phenomenological accounts because I am too afraid of speaking of semiotics in this context. So I'm trying to use my own weapons. But I'm sure that you will be able to develop more than I am able to this situation and these problems from a semiotic point of view. Because VR is usually qualified as solipsistic. It is true that actually when you have this experience of VR, of course, you can connect the headset to a screen. And so if I am having the experience, Thierry can see on the screen what's happening in my screen inside, but it is actually not the same because the screen is framed, whereas in my headset, I have a 360 environment all around me. So it is also true that you can have an intersubjective experience with VR headsets, especially if you are represented by an avatar, which would bring again us to a theological background of these new technologies, like bilocation for the saints. Avatar, as you know, is a term for incarnation of Vishnu, for example, in different visualizations on Earth. Solipsistic, and this is one of the reasons why, for example, one of the pioneers of virtual reality, Jaron Lanier, in the very first definition of what is virtual reality, it's those big headsets that make people look ridiculous from the outside, because it seems that you are fighting with ghosts, you know, and you are very much engaged physically, and from the outside you seem like a weirdo. No? And this is also interesting from, again, an Husserlian point of view, because Husserl defines objectivity and intersubjectivity as strictly and intimately correlated. You can have objectivity if you can share it with other people. No? So the fact that you are experiencing something in the headset, which is only your own personal experience, makes this situation a bit problematic as concerns precisely the there-ness for everyone. Again, the there, no? But actually, you are there alone, so to say. It's not a für jedermann da. Things can change if you switch from virtual reality to augmented reality. And in particular, the experience that we can have with holograms. Actually, they are not real holograms in the physical term, in sense of the term. They are pseudo hologram, but now I am not going to delve into this difference. They are called hologrammatic experiences.
Microsoft HoloLens brings
Like, for
holograms
example,
into the
HoloLens.
real world. Using transparent lenses, spatial sound, and an understanding of your environment, holograms look and sound like they're actually part of the world.
You are alone,
That
but you can
is
also
reality.
work in team here.
With
No?
Microsoft HoloLens, holograms are viewed through the
And you
holographic
see
frame
the same
centered in
object.
the
So
middle
you
of the view.
share, and from a
This preserves
phenomenological
critical
point of view,
vision,
that would
so you
be
can move freely, connect and collaborate with people around
here
you.
for everybody. Für
Holograms
jedermann
make
da.
reality don't block out, see and hear. This enables
So in this case, you have both the perception of the actual environment in normal, so to say, standard immediate perception, and you also have the integration of digital entities appearing, epiphany, say, again, using a theological term. The genealogy is not the hologram in the physical sense of the term, as I was saying. It's rather a projection which is called Pepper's ghost, patented in 1879 by a chemist, John Pepper. But if you go back, it's phantasmagoria. It's the idea that you sit together in a room and then ghosts appear. Ghosts, apparitions of the dead, for example. Now, this is the image of the frontispiece of one of the inventors of the phantasmagoria, Etienne Gaspard Robertson.
And it's here in Liège, right?
He was born here.
He was born in
And
Liège.
this image is here in Liège.
This image is here.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know. So
An amazing
this is
coincidence.
genius loci. Thank you for this. Thank you. And this has to do still nowadays with dead people and with resurrection. Again, you might have seen Michael Jackson resurrected, or Tupac Shakur also resurrected in holograms. So they reappeared in concert, and it is very interesting that if you read the comments of the fans, they say it's even better than when they were alive. So it does have to do with a question, a very anthropological question, because if you go back to theories which interrogate the very origin of image production, you would say that image production has to do with the reaction of the Homo sapiens to the insult of the death, of the idea of the body and life disappearing. So in holograms, again, we can ask about the here and there, but also not just for an intersubjective, but the intersubjective very quickly becomes political. And these are new political identities. For example, in Madrid, a protest against a bill, a law called Ley Mordaza. How could you say? It was a law felt to be anti-liberty law, anti-freedom. So Mordaza is a, how do you say, when you put a tissue on your mouth and you cannot speak?
Muzzle. Gag.
Gag. Thank you. So the authorities did not allow this protest. It was formally illegal. So they stayed at home, but they sent holograms. This is evidently not just intersubjective, but political, new political identities. Political identities, this is a protest, but political leaders are using this. For example, Modi, the Indian premier, has appeared in the form of hologram, bilocating himself through this technology, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon has used this technology. What's happened? In two presidential campaigns, 2017 and 2022. Let's see. He is even bolder than St. Francis, because St. Francis wanted to bilocate, while Mélenchon wants to be present in 7 cities simultaneously, multi-location. Lyon.
Et maintenant, à Paris.
Here there is another conflict, not between here and there, but between the technology and the stress, I think. The style of his stress. So he is here in Lyon physically, but he is also there in different places, in 7 cities, for example, in Paris and in other 6 places in France. And again, intersubjective, because everybody can see it, and political, in terms which I think must be attentively studied in the next decades. We must keep our eyes very well open. I will conclude with a final example. Sofia Pirandello, who is here, was the curator of this work in virtual reality produced by our ERC project, An Icon, the Italian Job, and realized by an Italian artist and Harvard scholar, Emilio Vavarella. What is the Italian Job? It's a very simple situation, and apparently very boring, because it is a normal Sunday in which Emilio and his friends do very simple things, eat an ice cream. Before eating an ice cream, they prepare breakfast, and then they go for a walk and they go swimming in a lake. But these 12 hours are recorded with a 360 camera placed on the head of Emilio. When you see this through your headset, you are together with Emilio. You are in a solidarity of corporeal position with him because you are anchored to his head. But at the same time, you can turn around your gaze and see what was there when Emilio was having that experience. But at the same time, he did not see because he didn't want to focus on that aspect of the world. So you, or he couldn't. So you can actually actualize a virtuality which was there while Emilio was doing his experience. I will give you a very short clip just to give you an example of what has been my own experience yesterday, because I recorded it yesterday. I had some technical difficulties. So it was a last minute thing, but just a few seconds to give you this idea. So he's reading a book, and then he goes to the kitchen, into the kitchen, and he prepares breakfast. And you can see. So you are there with him, and you cannot detach yourself from his body, which is Husserl. I am identified, so to say. It's an Einfühlung, which is also an embodiment in Emilio. But at the same time, turning around in the 360 environment, I have the possibility to see what Emilio did not actually see at the time, because he was focused, for example, on walking and not falling in the woods. So here I think we find a further possible development of that conflict and dialectics between here and there, which I think is an interesting field of investigation of the ways in which both virtual reality, augmented reality are challenging our traditional ideas of being with our own life. Thank you very much for your attention.